Hi and welcome to another episode of the Bonsai Stuff podcast. But you can't guess who it is. It's Scott Martin from Bonsai Matsu, and thank you very much for tuning in. Really do appreciate it that you guys are always there listening, and from the contact, everyone's keen to get this thing back on track. So let's do it. This episode of the podcast, I want to have a little bit of a chat about some technical stuff regarding forests and setting up forests, because I've actually got a few interesting stories lately. I've been making a few forests for a few different customers, and there's quite a bit to doing them, in my opinion, correctly. They can be just a slap together of trees, but you'll find that as you develop the forest, you'll maybe want to change a few things. So hopefully I can short track that a little bit for you if you are considering making a forest, or even give you a few tips here and there on developing a forest you may currently have in your collection. And I also want to talk about what's happening around the yard at the moment, because it's a really interesting time as we get towards late winter with the near close wrap up of repotting. And what we're in for, and what I'm looking for in the yard specifically to be the catalyst for me to do a few things. So we'll have a yak about that as well. But as always, let's get into it, eh? Sorry for the interruption. I really hope you're enjoying the podcast as much as I'm enjoying making it. Makes the bonsai world feel a little bit smaller and a lot more cozy. Anyway, I'd love for you to become a supporter of the podcast by subscribing for as little as $3 a month. This support will go directly towards the cost of producing this podcast, and it's entirely optional. The link to become a supporter is in the episode notes for each edition. Now that's over, let's get into the podcast. Now, forest bonsai, I love forest bonsai. I think technically they are possibly one of the most difficult to get right, because you've got so many different components to deal with. So much has to work in conjunction with each other, in synchronicity, and it is hard to do it, especially with a lot of trees. The more trees, the harder it is. The fewer the trees, you might be able to get the styling right, but it certainly shows up a lot of flaws in there as well, and maybe doesn't give you the feel for a forest that you'd essentially like. So I've been involved recently in making some massive forests where the pots are metre wide, and there's a lot of trees in there, 40 odd in one and 20 odd in another, and they're big trees. They can be up to sort of a metre tall in the centre section, and they're going to be magnificent. They're going to be really, really good. But what I suppose the catalyst for talking about it was that there's a lot goes into behind the scenes with a forest before you actually start throwing trees into dirt. And I think that part is the most important part. And we'll talk about it, but the one thing that will sort of shine by the end of this podcast is the need to have a plan. Without a plan, you're just sort of making it up on the fly, and yeah, sure, you'll get trees in dirt and there'll be a forest, like a forest of kinds. But as always, is it going to be the best use of those trees and the best use of your time, and something that's going to grow into be an amazing species that really can shine and make you happy long into the future? And if you just maybe followed a few simple steps and drawn breath before you started doing it, maybe it would be a little bit different. Because once these things are together, it's not like changing the angle on a tree in a pot, or changing a pot position, moving it left or right for a single tree. When it's a forest composition, once those trees join together, really you want to try and avoid taking them apart as much as you possibly can. So a couple of things. I want to start with the big one. Now, you need to have an idea before you start a forest how big you want it to be, like physically, how big you want this thing to be. Do you want it to be enormous? Do you want it to be something which is easily movable? Is the pot size roughly going to be 30 centimetres wide, or is it going to be sort of 3 metres wide? Like how big do you possibly want it to be? And there's constraints with that in regard to what's readily available to us in the commercial world from bonsai. There are options with slabs and that sort of thing. And don't forget that where you start the forest is not where it's going to finish. It's going to get bigger, it's going to get thicker, and it's going to grow over time. Might not feel like it, but it certainly does. Just like all of our bonsai, everything gets thicker. So you need to have a guide for yourself as to what you want to do before you start doing it. Then once you've got that, sourcing a pot, go for it. I know based here in Melbourne, there's some nurseries at different times have different size pots available. Sure, you can get a piece of slab of stone or something like that to work with as well. There's lots of options out there, but it is difficult, and you need to source it first. I wouldn't start making a forest without having the bones and the structure of this thing set perfectly. So once you've worked out the dimensions, like it might be that you say, okay, in my head, I'd like this thing to be about this wide. All right, how big's that wide? All right, that's about 80 centimetres. Cool. So to be 80 centimetre wide forest, you're going to need a pot that's about 70 to 80 centimetres wide, thereabouts. All right, start sourcing a pot that's going to suit a forest that's going to be that wide. And then think about what sort of forest do you want? What sort of species? Do you want deciduous? Do you want pines? Do you want junipers? Whatever it is that you want, then you pick an appropriate pot style that's going to suit that forest. So you've got the dimensions, you've got the type of tree that you want. Now you need to work out roughly the number of trees that you want to get into that pot. And that's hard. That's really, really hard, because before you go out there and spend your hard-earned and start sourcing these things, you've got a couple of things to consider with it. Now, genetics of these trees that you're going to source is going to be different. So if you're going out there to buy, let's pick a figure, 30. Let's say you want to make a maple forest and you want to throw in there 30 different trees, and you want some that are tall and you want some that are short, and you want a nice range of these things. The most difficult thing you can do or the most disappointing thing from my perspective, is when you start putting these trees together in winter and then they start to grow in spring and they all come into leaf at different times. And then the leaf comes out and the leaf size is very different and they grow differently. Some grow thick and coarse, others grow really fine. So inside your forest structure, you've got an array of, even though they're all, maples, trident maples, Japanese, whatever it is, they're all of the same species, their genetics are very different. So it can lead to a lot of disappointment very, very quickly with that sort of thing. So when I'm sourcing, or when I suggest that you source these things, is when they're in full leaf, if you're going down the deciduous path. So even though we're getting to the end of repotting now, it might not be something that you can do now, but there's, there are other options with different types of trees. And likewise, junipers are great. You can get them where they're very similar in their needle form, their scale form, so you can match them very, very closely together, and you can start to build something that's of like mind. Same as cedars. These couple that I put together were big cedars, Himalayan cedar and Atlantic cedar forest, and even though there's a little bit of difference between the genetics, all in all, they're pretty good, and time will tell. As they grow. One forest has been together for a little while now, a couple of years, and it's developing really, really nicely. The needle length's pretty similar on all of them. The needle colour's very similar on all of them as well, because the effort went in at the sourcing stage to make sure that they lined up as much as they possibly could. So you've got to work out how big you want it to be, how many trees you want to get in there, and break the number of trees up into large and small. I think a good forest, if you look at any images online or in books or whatever, anywhere you can find forest bonsai, if you have a look at really good ones, you'll see that they're broken into segments, most of them. There's negative space, so there's definitely areas where there's no trees growing, which is really, really important. And there's some dominant trees and there's some smaller trees towards the periphery. Because if you think about how, in nature, what we expect a forest to grow like, the big tall ones in the middle, they don't get much sunlight except on the tops of their canopy, and the smaller trees that sort of splay out to the sides, that sort of chase the sun, left and right as you're looking from the front of the pot, they sort of push out. They have a lot more foliage down further, and that's pretty much how I design my trees. It's like, the fingers spreading out. When I hold my two hands up side by side and I spread my fingers out, I have my main trees sort of towards the middle of the pot, offset front to back, left to right a little bit, so they're not uniform in any way. But I'll have the main trees in that middle section, and then as I move towards the outside edge of the pots, the trees start to bend a little bit further on their trunk line to give you that push that they naturally want to do. I don't think, for me, when I look at a forest that's got the trees all very vertical, very, very upright together side by side, it just doesn't give me the same feel as one that's got that splay of the trees towards the edge of the pot. Don't lay them down on their side or anything like that, but just get a nice angle flowing out towards the edge of the pot. I think that gives it a real, for me anyway, and it's a personal preference, but that's how I like to see it. You've got to pick with the number of trees, that you would have heard with forests, you've got to have 7, you've got to have 5, you've got to have 11, you've got to have an odd number of trees in your forest. Yep, that's true if you've got a small number of trees. If you're going to put 7 trees in there, roughly 7 trees looks much nicer than what 6 or 8 does. And you don't have to stick to this guideline, and I generally don't, because I think once you start lumping lots of trees in there, once you get above, let's say 10 odd trees, who cares? You're not going to know how many trees are in that forest anyway. And if someone sits there and counts them and goes, "Oh, you've got 32 trees," well, who cares? Like, seriously, it's the composition that you're going for. And I think the odd number works really well, because what I like to do when I have a smaller forest, let's say it's 7 trees, I'll split it 4 and 3. And if you did 4 and 4, it looks really, really balanced. If you did, let's say it was 6, 4 and 2, again, it can look really, really balanced. And that's why, I try and throw it out a little bit with that odd number on one side and even number on the other. That to me sits really nice. But then when you get towards 8, a 5 and a 3, who cares? It's going to look, if it looks nice, then, and that's what you've got available to you, then sure, that's what I would go for. So you've got, size of pot, you've got to consider size of composition and number of trees that you've got to be in there. Then you've got to start the fun part. You've got to go out there, you've got to source your pot, and you've got to go and source the stock before you do anything else. Once you get the trees, then what I like to do is get a piece of paper, or I've got a big whiteboard. I get all the trees in the room together and I split them apart into large, medium and small trees, especially for a big forest. This part's the really, really important part. And I draw on the board, let's say it's a big oval pot, then I'll go and draw a big oval onto the board. I'll put a marker pen on each of the pots and label them 1 right the way through to X, whatever, however many trees you got, 1 to 20 odd, whatever it is. And it doesn't matter. You don't have to label them, from smallest to biggest, whatever works for you. But what I'll do then is I will look at the trees and I'll go, okay, so if I've got a big collection and I've got room on the ground that's roughly about the size of the pot, or maybe even double the size of the pot, because the trees, when they come out of the pots that they're in, the grow pots that they're in, they'll get a smaller footprint. They might be in a reasonable size black plastic pot or something like that. When you take them out of that, it's going to get smaller. So the trees can actually physically be a lot closer together than what you can shove them together on the ground while they're in their grow pots, right? So on the floor, I'll go, okay, this tree is number 15. All right, that's going to be my first dominant tree. I'm going to put you here. And if you imagine on the drawing that you've got, if you do a series of grids, straight lines vertical and straight lines horizontal, like a piece of graph paper, right? That's probably a great way of doing it. Use a piece of graph paper. And what you've got to try and avoid at all costs is trees placed on the same vertical line or the same horizontal line, okay? So, you put tree number whatever, main tree number 1. I always start with the biggest trees first and work my way down to the smaller trees. So main tree is my best tree that I've got in the forest that I really want to see. I don't want to hide this thing away. It might be looking at the center of the pot, it might be just a little bit to the left side of the center and maybe, 1 or 2 grid lines back from the front, just so it's not smack in the middle, not too symmetrical. But it's a dominant tree. And when I place it, I go, okay, now from the front, I want to make sure that I see that thing, because that's my number 1 tree. Then number 2 tree, which is, the second largest, second most significant tree that I've got, I'll look at that and go, okay, well, I've got 2 options in my mind when I'm making the forest. I can put you somewhere near the dominant tree, maybe a little bit further to the left and maybe to the front, so you can start building a really dominant side on that left side of the pot. Or you can become number one tree on the right side of the collection that I've got. Because I remember I talked about the negative space. I try and get like not a path, but some kind of a break between the two segments of the forest that sort of draws the viewer in. For me, I really like that approach to building a forest. It doesn't have to be that way, but that's what I like. So when I'm positioning these trees, I'm putting them on the floor. I'm going, yep, tree number one, massive, perfect. Tree number two, second best tree in the lot, maybe not as thick, not as tall. All right, you're going to go here. And I work my way down. Whatever that working your way down is, it doesn't matter. You don't have to make the forest to the same requirements or specifications every single time. There's not a pattern that we follow. The only thing that I look for is a randomness to the placement, and by that I mean when I look down, when I sit there and I look at the front of the tree, I get to eye level at that pot and I look at the base of those trunks. I don't want anything obscured by a tree in front of it, and I don't want a tree hidden at the back. I want to have them so they're positioned so they're all just slightly out, so there's always interest. By means they can be very close to that line, but try and avoid that. And with the plan, just keep drawing it out, keep sketching it out. You'll need to, word to the wise, you will have to amend your plan on the fly when you are putting it all together, because not everything goes exactly the way it should. But I tell you what, it makes it a hell of a lot faster. Spending an hour planning for this thing, or 2 hours planning, will mean that your forest can be made in a couple of hours as opposed to maybe a day, and then you're not quite content with where it is the following day when you look at it. I think that plan really puts you on the path to successfully building your forest and makes it really easy. The next thing you need to do, once you've got your plan, you've got your trees, you've got your pot's ready to go, you've got to do a lot of prep work in the pot area prior to making a forest, to building a forest. That's the key to this thing. Like, you think about a pot that we normally use for our bonsai, and especially if you've been doing repotting lately, or you know how important the holes are in the bottom of the pot for tying your tree in. And tying your tree in is really, really super important. I go on about it all the time that that tree being secure in the pot makes a massive difference to how well it's going to grow and its overall health and strength. So when you're thinking about a forest, you buy a pot. That pot still is only going to have, let's say at best 4, 6. Let's say it's got 8 holes. Let's say it's got 10 holes on a metre wide pot. That's nothing. That is absolutely nothing. So if you're putting 40, 50 trees into one of these pots, how the hell do you tie them in? Like, how do you get enough wire there to start to tie it in? And it's really, really easy. The method that I use, that I sort of promote, is using a bamboo grid. And what I mean by that is, we talked about having a grid to make your plan, a piece of graph paper. The bamboo model is very similar to that, where you take lengths of bamboo that are long enough and wide enough, and take it away from the pot and just lay them on the ground, and you space these things in a horizontal and a vertical grid on the floor, where they're all, let's say, roughly 10 centimetres apart. All right, maybe a bit less, depending on the size pot that you've got and how many trees you've got to tie in there, but let's just use a figure of a consistent measure of 10 centimetres apart, so they create all these little squares. Then what you do is you get a little bit of wire. It can be 1 mil wide, 1.5 mil wide. It doesn't need to be much. And at the junctions where those pieces of bamboo cross over, so you lay all the horizontal ones down first, and then on top of that you put all the vertical ones. So you've got this grid. Just where they have their intersection, just tie a little loop of wire in there and tighten it with your pliers and cut it nice and short, so it holds the grid intact, right? So by this stage you should have a nice big rectangle-looking piece of bamboo mesh, effectively, that's going to be put into the bottom of your pot before you do anything. So then you get your pot, you put in your mesh, and you feed a couple of little wires up through each of the holes. And what those little wires are going to do is they're going to come through and they're going to grip onto that bamboo grid that you've made, and they're going to hold that bamboo grid in place. So then what I do, before you tie it into the pot, you sit this bamboo structure on top of the pot, and you'll see where you've got to cut it. Just use your branch cutters. That's why I like using the bamboo, because one, it's really light, doesn't add weight to the composition. Secondly, it can be cut really easy with just your branch cutters, because it's only, it's not as thick as, you get one that's as thick as a pencil, this bamboo. It doesn't need to be super sturdy. It doesn't need to be, as thick as your thumb. Maybe around your little finger, something like that would be about okay. And so you can cut around the outside of it. But then the other part that I really like about it is once you've put in some tie-down wires onto this bamboo grid, which is the next part that we do, and the trees are tied in there over the period of time, that bamboo will disintegrate and rot away. So it's not a problem. It's not a permanent structure. If you use some kind of plastic or something like that, I wouldn't use metal regardless, but if you use some kind of plastic in this plastic grid, then there's a good chance that that's never going to break down in 5 lifetimes. So you're going to have an issue removing it somewhere down the track from that forest. So now you've got this bamboo grid, you've made it, you've used your little wires to join it all together, you've laid it over the top of the pot, you've cut it down to size so it fits in beautifully and snugly into the bottom of the pot. You've got your pot with the mesh, you've got a few little tie-in wires coming up through the bottom of the pot to tie in the bamboo grid. Now what you do is with the bamboo grid itself is at a hell of a lot of places. The more trees that you're putting into this forest, the more of these you have to do. Take a length of, let's say, I'm using my fingers here. Let's say 30 centimetres of 2 to 2.5 mil wide. Go with 2.5 mil wide. Find the halfway point with it, loop that underneath the bamboo grid, and then just give it 2 or 3 turns. So you have these 2 wires shooting straight up into the air, and you do that all over the grid, the bamboo grid. So then what that means is once you've tied that bamboo grid in and it's got its 2 or 3 or 4 securing points holding it down nice and firm into the base of the pot, you've got, 20, 30, 40, 50 of these double wire tie-in things that we can use to create like a grid of tie-in wires that's going to force down the forest and hold it in place. So you've got it all ready to go. Your pot's ready to go. The bamboo's tied in there. Then you put a layer of scoria over the bamboo grid. That's your drainage layer. Then put a thin layer of your potting mix, your bonsai soil over the top of that. Then you're set, ready to go. Then it's a matter of starting to make the composition, starting to put these trees in. And when you do it, just do one tree out of its pot at a time. Work on the roots. Have the grid graph in front of you, your plan in front of you, and then position them. Maybe put a little bit of soil underneath into the cavity of the root ball. Look at tying it in. Get one tree at a time placed, and then start working on the next ones. It's something that I think the more you prepare for, the easier it's going to feel. The less you prepare for it, the harder it's going to feel. It's going to feel almost impossible to get this thing right without just by the end going, you know what, sun's going down, I'm running out of time, I'm just going to throw these trees in there. It's been a good couple of hours and I've really feel like I've got nowhere. Another piece of advice I'd give you is with the tie-in wires that you've used, you make an extra 20 or 30 of these little 2.5 mil tie-in wires. You might not use them all, but I wouldn't cut them off when you finished doing the tie-ins. Just shove them under the soil surface. So if something happens down the track, if heaven forbid, one of the trees in the forest dies, or your dog comes along and chews a couple off, or what, opossums climb over the top of the tree and eat them to a stub, well, at least you've got some tie-in wires there to use to tie in replacement trees into that forest. It does happen, unfortunately, when you're making these forests, but having these extra tie-ins there will make life so much easier for you down the track, because it's almost impossible once you've got that forest set to go, and you've put in your soil, you put your sphagnum on top, you've watered this thing in, you've patted it all down, it's ready to go, and then 2 or 3 months later you find that a tree's died, or later on you might want to change the composition and add a few trees to it. Trying to get tie-in wires down to the bottom of that tree, that bottom of that grid, it's almost impossible. So you're going to end up doing more damage than good. So by leaving some of these wires in there, it'll certainly give you options for the future on what you can do. Right. So one of the other really important factors that you're going to have to consider with a forest too, and normally forests are bigger. The vast majority of the forests are, someone's planted a heap of seeds. They've grown some trees out of it, and they look at it and go, now I've got 40 or 50 of these things left over. What the hell am I going to do with them? You know, you're taking cuttings and suddenly they've all grown. They're all the same age. They're all the same tree. The genetics are all the same. Fantastic. Looking good. What are you going to do with them? That's when a forest generally gets lumped together because you've got all these plots left over, and it's a nice way of, I was just saying this the other day when I made a forest, it's a nice way of turning 40 trees into one bonsai. Certainly cleans up your yard a lot, and they are lovely forests. They're very hard to get the composition right and very hard to develop over time. But when they're done right, they look amazing, and they're very satisfying. They're very, very calming. There's something about the forest that makes you, I don't know, just makes you smile. Makes me smile anyway. So one major consideration you've got to have is because they are in big pots, it's how the hell are you going to move this thing around? And how do you repot a forest? And how do you get to the back of it? You know, let's say it's on a bench and there's a fence behind it and this thing weighs, you know, upwards of 50 kilos. How are you going to get around this thing? Like, how are you going to physically get in behind it to work it? And is it going to get enough sunlight? So you've just got to consider so much before you actually make the forest. If you've got an open bench, they're the best. If you can have, you know, a bench in where you can access it left, right, and centre, you know, all the way around this thing, then that's ideal. And a forest should be something which is a feature of your display in your garden, because they are amazing and they're awe-inspiring. You know, you can have some really small trees there and put them next to some big ones and prune them right and give them the love, and you'd be amazed how many of your friends will turn around and look at that one first, as opposed to maybe a tree that you think's, you know, a million times better, but they love the forest, because that's, you know, we're all drawn to forests. We're all tree lovers. You know, that's what it is. So accessibility for your forest, for you to do the work, is a consideration for before you make it, not 6 months down the track. That's when things turn really bloody pear-shaped, and you'll pay the price for not having it set up right. So just consider that as a major factor. And just out of interest, one of my customers, this brilliant fella, he's got a lovely podium made, and he also had a piece of stone put on top as the turntable with some like a turntable system underneath. It's got marbles in it that spins this thing. It's, you know, it's over a metre wide, this pot. It's enormous, weighs a bloody ton, but you can spin it with one finger and it gets right the way around. So working on it becomes a breeze, but also the ability to, you know, share the love with the sunshine becomes not a problem. You know, and if things are easy, as I've said, if things are easy, you'll do it. If it's difficult, then you just won't. So, you know, scenario where that pot can't be moved, but maybe it doesn't get enough sunlight where it is, you know, should you rotate the pot? Yeah, you should. Are you going to? 100% you're not going to do it, because it's way too bloody hard to do it, and it's going to take 4 people to pick up that thing and awkwardly turn it around, and it's just not going to happen. So accessibility is a massive one that you need. The other thing I want to talk about too is when you've got a lot of stock in a forest that generally is about the same age, you need to understand how you can manage that, the growth on those trees, to keep the smaller trees small and look young, and the older trees to grow and look like they're significantly older. You know, so, and that's got to do with sacrificing branches, also letting things grow a lot taller, a bit unchecked, and also the stuff that you want to keep small and you want to keep refined, just being on top of it. You know, you've got to be really vigilant with a forest, especially when you're developing it and starting to make the formation of the different trunk, the variability of the trunk thicknesses from your largest to your smallest. Your smallest ones have to be pruned far more regularly than what your bigger ones do. So you've got other considerations. You know, I talked about the longer something gets, the thicker it's going to get, the more coarse it's going to get. So you can't just, with a forest, let everything in the centre and the bigger trees just grow like crazy, because you'll end up with really thick, ugly structure and have to cut that back. Whereas the stuff down lower, the smaller stuff towards the outside of the forest, you've been pruning a lot more, stays fine, stays delicate, starts to, you know, really ramify up. So you need to strategically have correct sacrifice branches on the larger stuff that allow them to grow and thicken. And it's actually not that easy because, you might have, a forest of 30 trees. You might have, let's break it down a little bit, maybe five smaller ones, really, really small, 5 slightly bigger, and it works its way up to the larger ones. And larger ones might only be sort of 1 or 2 significant trees inside that forest. So your sacrifices, you need to manage those as well. There might be, 15 trees inside the forest that you're allowing sacrifices to run on, but they've all got to do their job just enough without doing it too much. Otherwise, you're going to have all those trees thickening exactly the same rate. So that's what I mean. This composition, the complexity of building a forest is not to be underestimated because, your sacrifice branches, you go, yep, sure, run from here, go here, do this, that. Yep, no worries. I've got the points they're going to come from. All right, so they all shoot off at exactly the same rate. But so you're sort of the smaller of the trees that you want sacrifice branches on, maybe you let them grow for, a period. Then you take the tips out of those and go, righto, you guys stop. And then a couple of weeks later, 2 or 3 weeks later, the next lot, okay, take the tips out of those ones. Next ones, a couple of weeks later, tips out of those ones. And the biggest ones, let them keep growing. And then, the next year it might be do the same thing again, but, it gets to the bigger ones and you go, okay, now of the 2 main ones I've got, second largest tree, I'm going to cap you, but tree number 1, you keep going. You've got another year up your sleeve, and it's a real delicate balancing act to make sure that you get it right. What I'd be saying to you is keep that plan that you drew and maybe, use different color markers or highlighters or something like that and go, okay, these are the small ones, these are the medium ones, and these are the large ones. So when you come back to it year on year on year, while you're developing these things, you look at the plan and go, okay, yep, you guys, you're getting cut. You guys, sacrifice branches, all of you. But you guys, with your sacrifice branches, in a month's time, I'm coming back. I'm going to cut you off. You other guys, and just it's that planning process that you've got to follow and be vigilant with time and time and time again with a forest to eventually get there. If you just throw it together and go, yeah, I've done a forest, give yourself a pat on the back, well, that's great. But is it going to really grow like a forest? It's not really. You're going to need to do a lot of work in the background to get these things. So hope you can tell, it's been sort of half an hour of the podcast, me yabbering on about forests, which I didn't think would be possible. But I do really thoroughly love the forest. I do respect them when they're done correctly. And I do love the intent of the designer when they get it right. When they really get these forests right. Now, I beg you, look, next time you go to a bonsai show, next time you see bonsai somewhere, next time it's online, whatever, and you see the forest and it jumps out at you, look at it and go, what do I love about that forest? You don't mimic it, don't copy it, but there'll be something about it. And for me, like I said, it's that negative space that really draws me into a forest where I go, how easy would it be when you've got 100 trees stuck together to allow all that foliage just to merge into one? All right, it's so hard and so disciplined to have the intent that you have that negative space where me as a viewer goes, wow, look at that spot. Nothing's grown in that area of the forest. That's amazing. That's really, really lovely. It might not be your cup of tea, but hey, that's what rocks my boat. So that floats my boat. So I'm into it. I like it. That's what I really enjoy. But likewise, if you see a forest and it doesn't make you happy, you look at it and go, yeah, it's okay. Look at it. See what it is about that forest and keep it to yourself. Don't use it as a means of insulting someone by saying, oh, you haven't done negative space, you idiot. But seriously, look at it and go, what would I change about that composition to make it something that I like? Or look at what's been done in that forest that you don't like and go, well, okay, I'm not going to do that with mine because all those trunks look the same, or they're all growing in the same direction, they're all growing straight up, or they're whatever. It might be anything about the composition that you don't enjoy. Then use it as a learning for yourself to make sure that you don't repeat the same process. And when you build your forest, because your forest is for you, it's not for me, it's not for anyone else in the world. When you build your forest composition for yourself, make it something that you look back and go, you know what, I love it. That's cracking. That's perfect. That's exactly what I love about forest. And if it's not, develop a plan to start. Even if you've got a forest in front of you right now and you listen to me talk and go, oh, Scott said I should have negative space in there. I'm not saying you should have negative space in there, but if you go, well, negative space would make it look better, then work out the strategy. Which trees do you remove of the forest to get that, or how do I prune them to make sure that I get that feel, or, develop a plan, stick to the plan, repeat it over and over and over, and see where the hell it takes you. So as I said, I'm coming towards the end of winter. Thank goodness, the sun's out shining, the wind's starting to blow with that change of season, which does my head in every time. Wind's the least loved of all the elements for me, but it is that time where I know that pine repotting's on for me, because everything's starting to grow, and a few of the pines that have been through the workshop where we're sort of jumping into repotting them, and then you take them out, you can see there's a lot of new root growth in there. So they're all starting to move. The buds are starting to swell. So it's time for me to put the full stop on repotting with pines. That's going to be something which is happening over the next few weeks, and we'll run towards sort of late August for me in Melbourne. My deciduous are done. Junipers are pretty much done. There's maybe a few left to go, but they're all looking good. Stuff's transitioning back out to the sheltered parts of the benches now. It's been long enough in the workshop. It's been sheltered enough. It's been given enough love that things are starting to pop. Buds are starting to move. There's blossoms starting to appear on trees, and I can't get the smile off my face, because I know the warm weather's going to be here, and I know that there's going to be some sunshine. So if you're in the northern hemisphere, I'm really sorry you're about to head to the cooler months, but I've had enough. I want some sunshine. I like the warm weather much more. I know it's not great for the trees being in stinking hot weather, and they're already warning us that they're in for a long, hot, dry summer this year, thanks to some changing climatic conditions. But like I said in an earlier podcast, it's the time to look at your watering systems now to make sure that you've done the repotting that you need to do, that water can get into those trees' roots, and those trees' roots are strong enough that transpiration can take place, and you're not going to have an impact from it. And be prepared, shade structures, all that sort of stuff. If you can't say we haven't been warned that this is coming. It's not pleasant, it's not nice, and it's not really what I wish. But it is coming, and we have to deal with it accordingly, and make sure that we've got adequate protection in place to make sure that we're doing the best we can. So that's what I've been doing around the yard as well, just making sure that everything's okay. I've seen a lot of increased insect activity around the place, which is it's normal this time of year. I look back to my time lime sulfuring the trees and think thank goodness, because it's going to give me a bit of a head start when all this foliage starts popping out everywhere, all these buds that are starting to push now and start to come out. So I am definitely making sure that I visit my local hardware stores and get what I need to make sure that I can protect my bonsai accordingly with insecticides and fungicides and that sort of thing. I have noticed also on some trees that there's a few root aphids around. I've talked about root aphids before. They are a bit nasty little buggers, and they're there. And it's just a reminder to me to again, keep an eye on some of the trees that maybe haven't been repotted. I do see it a lot in Australian natives. They tend to get it a lot more than a lot of my exotics. But I just have to be mindful that if I see a native starting to struggle, then I've got to use a systemic insecticide that can get in there, just in case it is root aphids, because digging around in the pots may not help me find it. I may not see it. So it's just having seen it when I'm repotting. You look at trees from the surface, yeah, that looks great, pop it out of the pot. Hey, hang on a minute, everyone have a look at this. This is root aphids. This is what they look like. This is the damage they're going to do. And now when you look back at the tree and you see that maybe it's not quite as strong as what it should be, or the one, its brother beside it, then root aphids are the common thread. So I've got to just be mindful that sometimes the normal spraying that I'm doing isn't going to be effective enough, and you've got to be very pinpoint accurate with what you're trying to achieve with the trees. And I find this nice, systemic insecticide that I use, a little granular one, water into the roots, doesn't have any byproduct issues, killing our bees or anything like that. So it's nice and effective for what I want. The other thing that is a community service announcement for the podcast is watering. And I know it's still chilly outside. It's still cool. The overnight temperatures are starting to increase. As I said before, the wind is starting to pick up for me, and I've been caught out again every change of season. Every season it happens to me with watering. I get caught out where I look at it and go, no, it's been dewy overnight. Walk out there, the grass is wet. Have a look at the pots. Yeah, no, they still feel a bit wet. They're all okay. And you go about your business and come back a bit later on, and next thing you know, there's a bit of a few of the natives are starting to drop a few of their leaves, and it's like, oh god, they've dried out too much. And you get that moisture meter out, you stick it in there and go, god, that's bone dry. So just be careful with the watering. Don't just think because it's cold or there's been a bit of rain. That's the big catch, is just because it's rained outside. Getting 1 mil of rain is really useless when it comes to watering your bonsai. So my watering frequency is definitely on the up at the moment as the trees start to take off. While the foliage necessarily hasn't come out or extended fully, the buds are just starting to move. The roots are starting to move, and they don't want to grow in a dry dust bowl. So just make sure you're keeping an eye on it. Don't be lax about it because you aren't seeing anything on top of the pots. And I'm not quite at the daily watering mark. It's getting close. It's getting very close. So just keep an eye on it. And I just want to finish the podcast by saying that I go on and on about it all the time, but repeated application of good techniques makes such a big difference. Whether it's watering, whether it's wiring, whether it's fertilizing, whether it's how we apply insecticides to our tree, whether it's the way that you're tying your trees into your pots or you're developing a forest, whatever it is, repeated application, like doing the same thing the correct way using really good techniques makes such a big difference. So just do everything you can with your bonsai to the best of your ability and don't leave things to chance. And if you do need to reach out, then, I'm only an email away or a social media message away, and you can ask about it. Don't leave it too long, and change of season always brings it, whether it's northern for the cooler or southern hemisphere for the coming into the warmer months. It's time to be on guard and make sure that you keep an eye on everything. Righto, well, that brings us to the end of the podcast. Thank you for sticking around as always. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope if you haven't got a forest, maybe you think about it, because it is something that's lovely to have inside your collection and very rewarding as well. It gives you completely different planning structure to a normal bonsai or to anything else that you'll have in your collection, and hopefully it's thorough enough. If I've missed anything, if there's a point that maybe you think, hey, you didn't talk about whatever, then please let me know. But once those roots fuse together on your forest, you'll find that they very much become one tree. And when it comes time to repot these things, they come out and you work on the root ball as one tree. They go in separate. Those roots fuse together. It becomes a solid mass like any other bonsai that you've got, and you repot it exactly the same way as what you would a normal individual bonsai. A bit more root work with scissors and stuff like that, cleaning the nabaris and whatever else on the individual trees to make them lift. But pretty much you're doing things as one. And the part I love that I didn't talk about was that when they do fuse, they become one tree, and the stronger trees support the weaker trees. So it's really if you read any books or any literature about forests, it gives me shivers, gives me tingles up my arm thinking that here's these things that you think are very very basic, just a tree, but oh my god, there's so much more. And the way they look out for each other and do everything, it's amazing. But anyway, that's that's another time, another place to talk about that sort of stuff. And also that it is a really important time to change a season, to be prepared, be ready to go again. Talked about being ready for repotting. Now that's sort of on the tail end, coming towards the other side, which is the growing season. Get ready with your fertilising and everything else that's going to come with it, with that lovely, lush new growth that's going to emerge on our trees that we can harness the power of. So really appreciate you listening in. I love it that so many people get so much out of this podcast. It puts a smile on my dial. It pushes me on every single time to keep searching for new content that's going to be of interest that people can listen to. I heard last couple of podcasts with the break, people were listening over and over and over to the same thing. I'm sorry that the content wasn't there, but I'm glad it was a podcast that you got a lot out of, and maybe have a listen back to some of the earlier ones too. But anyway, as always, give your trees a cuddle, and I love hearing from you. Reach out if you need to, and until next time, happy bonsai.